Hello and welcome to another update on the Digital Tolkien Project. These were originally supposed to be monthly updates, but I skipped last month due to travel. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But for those of you who are new here, I try to do these videos once a month, maybe once every 2 months, to give updates about what's going on at the Digital Tolkien Project, give sneak peeks into new things, make announcements and so on, and really give updates on the latest developments with the project without the pressure of putting together a polished video. It's also a great opportunity if you are able to attend live to ask questions and have discussions in the chat and so on. But of course, you can always watch these videos later as well. I've got a bunch of stuff to talk about today. Some updates on stuff that I've talked about in the past, but also something new at the end. If you're watching the recording of this, you can of course jump to that announcement. I'll put chapter time codes in the description, but I'm excited about what I'm going to be announcing at the end. It's small, but I think very significant for what we're doing here at the Digital Tolkien Project. Okay, so I mentioned that the reason that we didn't have a live update last month was due to travel. I was in Alaska and parts of Canada, including the Yukon, which you can see here. One of the reasons why I want to show this is because I found myself when I was traveling constantly thinking about what part of Middle-earth most corresponds to where I'm currently at. I don't know if it's because I've been doing so much annotation in Rimbë and thinking about some of the stuff that Artcraft is doing and so on. But whenever I'm in a place, tell me if you're the same. I'd be interested to hear in the chat or in the comments if you're watching later. Do you find yourself when traveling thinking this is this corresponds to this part of Middle-earth or whatever? I'm also intrigued. So this is a picture of in the Yukon. I'm interested in what people immediately associate, because of that constant mountains in the distance. It always felt like, to me, like that was the Misty Mountains, and maybe I was in Holland at the moment or something. Anyway, that's why I wasn't able to do a live stream a month ago. But there is a lot of, as I said, some exciting stuff to talk about today. I think this is a really exciting year for the Digital Tolkien Project. It already has been in the first half, and I think the second half is going to be even more exciting. Just to hint at a couple of things, we have some really fun collaborations and that are going on, partnerships. There's some fun stuff that you're going to see right towards the end of the year. I won't say anything more other than to say December's going to be a lot of fun. But even prior to that, there's some interesting stuff that we're working on and that I'm working on personally as well. There's an article that I'm writing for a certain society's bulletin about the Digital Tolkien Project, and I'm really excited about that because it's going to be the first time that I get to put into longish form words exactly what the Digital Tolkien Project is, what it's about, what its history is, what its goals are, and so on. So that'll be really nice to have that description. The other thing, I can't say too much about this now, but I have also been invited to, on a more scholarly level, contribute a book chapter to a book that's probably, I don't know when it's going to come out, 2025, 2026, a major new scholarly book on Tolkien, and I have been asked to write a chapter for that on the application of digital humanities and corpus linguistics and that sort of stuff to Tolkien studies, which is really exciting as well. There's some other stuff as well, conferences and things that are being worked on that I'll talk more about in the coming months. But the things that I do want to talk about today, I want to give a little bit of an update on some Hobbit related stuff that's being driven by the course that I'm currently running on the history of the Hobbit. I want to take a brief diversion to talk about some fun that I had with the first few issues of Vinyar Tengwar. I'm going to give a brief update on Rimbë and what we're doing with the annotations there, and then I'll have my little announcement. Phil, you asked in the channel about progress on the home digitization. That's going slowly, step by step. one of the things that I decided to do earlier this year with regard to the home digitization is, rather than try to do it volume by volume, which I'd done an initial pass of during my teaching last year, but now my focus is more on sort of extracting certain parts of home that are relevant to some other thread. So most of the focus earlier this year was on extracting things related to the Turin story, the Turin saga, as I sometimes refer to it as. So not necessarily trying to digitize and mark up all of Book of Lost Tales Volume 2, but to pull out the chapter about Turambar and the Foal, okay, and similarly with other volumes. And that's turned out to be quite a fruitful approach, because you can get results sooner being able to do comparisons. But in terms of doing comparisons, which I've talked about before, sort of doing comparisons with different versions of the Turin story, I do want to give a little bit of a demo of some stuff. People who've done or are doing my History of the Hobbit class have seen this, but I want to talk a little bit about some alignment that I'm doing with the Hobbit. So, for those of you who are not aware, the way that John Ratliff presents not the way he presents it, it's the manuscript and typescript situation with the Hobbit, is that there was some initial work done, handwritten, about 12 pages, of which we only have 6, unfortunately, of Tolkien writing the opening to the Hobbit. And then there's a typed version that kind of is a second pass through that goes quite a bit further, almost to the end of chapter 1. And then Tolkien, over an extended period of time, wrote in what Ratliff calls a second phase, wrote continuing on from the end of that initial typescript to about chapter 15. And in class, we're up to chapter 7 of The Hobbit, the corresponding manuscripts and typescripts for the chapter 7, and I'll be starting next month on the second part of the course, where we'll be doing chapters 8 through 15, the end of the second phase. But one of the things that I wanted to do was extract out of the History of the Hobbit the transcriptions that John Ratliff has done, and then actually be able to do comparisons. So I just want to show you a quick view of that. So the initial handwritten manuscript, the 12 pages of which we only have the second half, the last 6 pages of, John Ratliff refers to as the Prifdin fragment, because at that stage the dragon was called Prifdin. And then the typescript that replaced it is referred to by Ratliff as the Bledorthan typescript, because for a large part of the writing of The Hobbit, Gandalf was called Bledorthan, and Thorin was called Gandalf. But it's really interesting when you actually... So what I've done here is put side by side the Bledorthan typescript and the latest text, the 5th edition, whatever you want to call it, of the Hobbit. Well, the digital Tolkien version of that. And it's really fun seeing the differences. I might actually try to do an article or a talk at some stage about sort of the stylistic and linguistic differences. Not so much the content differences, although there's a little bit of that's fun, but also just the way that Tolkien decided to reword what he said. I want to point out a couple of things here. So again, in the context of Digital Tolkien Project, I've been digitizing these texts and then identifying what are the differences between them and visualizing them in this way. So red means a deletion from the draft. Green means an insertion in the final version, or in this case, the latest 5th edition version. And then yellow is just where there's clearly corresponding passages that have just been reworded. And you get really interesting things. So I'll just point out, I don't want to recapitulate my entire class, but there's a couple of things I want to point out. One is things like the shift from Hobbit's Hole to Hobbit Hole. Hobbit's Hole is much more descriptive if you're not familiar with it, right? If it's a hole that belongs to a hobbit. By turning it from this possessive Hobbit's Hole to Hobbit-Hole, Hobbit-hole, it just becomes as if it's a much more expected, familiar term. Oh, it's a Hobbit hole. And this is something you see, it's talked about by linguists quite a lot, that you initially start off with this kind of descriptive, oh, it's a hobbit's hole. And you very much separate that. You put stress on both the hobbits and the hole. You say hobbit's hole. But then as it becomes more familiar, you actually drop the stress on the second part of it and you say hobbit hole. And Tolkien captures this really nicely with that hyphenation. So there's this kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about that, but I'll point out a couple of other things. One of the really interesting things is that in the drafts, Gandalf was always described as a little old man. And there's a bunch of places where the word little is used. And Tolkien must have realized at some point that that's misleading because Bilbo is obviously much smaller than Gandalf. So calling Gandalf, or Bledorfin as he's called in the draft, little is a bit confusing. And so you see the word little, old man, just gets changed to an old man. An even bigger change that gets made, of course, is in describing Gollum as little. That's something that he didn't remove, but rather added because of certain depictions of Gollum that were too big in the first edition. Subsequent editions of The Hobbit actually add more description of Gollum being small. So you get things like the Bledorfin rather than Gandalf and so on. There's interesting changes like Belladonna Took apparently never had any adventure other than becoming Mrs. Bungo Baggins in the draft, which becomes ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. So all sorts of fun changes here that are much easier to see in this kind of visualization of the text side by side. This is a lot harder to do if you actually, if you've got John Ratliff's book or something and you're reading his transcription. He has some good textual notes pointing out certain changes, but being able to see it this way, I think, is really useful. And of course, this is the kind of thing that I ultimately want to do with all sorts of versions of the texts, including all the sorts of stuff that's in the history of Middle-earth. One other thing that I started doing alongside of that is, it's funny you mentioned the first edition. So let me say a little bit about that. I was planning on it anyway. And that's that so one of the issues I should point out with doing this kind of comparison between the early drafts and the current version is you can't necessarily tell whether the changes were made from the draft to the first edition or between the first edition and the fifth edition. I mentioned the Gollum change, for example, which was made after the first edition, not from the draft to the first edition. So having the first edition is actually really useful as well. So that is something that I've been doing alongside with this. And so that enables this kind of comparison, which is not a draft to published version comparison, but a comparison between first edition and the latest text. And this is something that I certainly want to continue with. It's very slow going, in part because not only do I need to make the comparison between the first edition and the last text, but I also have to correct the digital version of the first edition. So, there are mistakes. The first edition was, the digital version of the first edition was achieved through scanning the facsimile version of the first edition and then OCRing it using optical character recognition. But there's mistakes that get found as we go through this, and it's going to be really interesting when this is done. I would love to be able to sort of see how much I can make publicly available of this kind of comparison. The view that I'm showing here, for example, it's only showing those paragraphs that differ. So this is all there is to the difference between the first chapter in the first edition and the latest text. And so there may be aspects of this that, I can come to some agreement on publishing, because I think this would be really, really interesting. There's all sorts of sort of factual content changes that get made from the first to the latest edition. Dates, for example, Tolkien made a mistake with the date here. And you get things like the mentions of Lilliputians and so on that got removed from the first edition. Some interesting references to the broader legendarium that got slightly tweaked suggesting here that going off and sailing to the other side, in other words, Valinor, that gets muted a little bit in later versions and so on. So there's the removal of the very famous removal of tomatoes. That sort of stuff is very easy to see in this kind of comparison. So I'd love to have a way of making this sort of stuff available. A lot of this sort of information is in partial form in like Doug Anderson's wonderful annotated Hobbit, but there's a lot that could be done just sort of at this comprehensive level in terms of presenting it. Anyway, that's enough about the Hobbit alignment. I want to say something briefly about YouTube, which is that YouTube decided for whatever reason a few weeks ago that I was not eligible for any kind of payment because I haven't proven my identity. And so channel memberships are currently stalled. I don't think you can do super thanks, tips. And I'm not eligible yet for ad revenue anyway. We need to get to more watch hours. 4,000 watch hours, is it? Yeah, we're almost there. We could make it in the next few months. But YouTube doesn't want to pay me anything because I haven't proven my identity, and they won't let me prove my identity because they know I live in the US, but my passport's Australian, and so they won't accept an Australian passport. So anyway, I don't want to bother you with that problem other than to say if you were thinking of becoming a channel member or you are one and your payments have been paused or whatever, that's the reason. I need to sort out identification issues with YouTube. A little frustrating. Okay, one other thing I want to mention before I talk about Rimbë and the new thing that I want to announce, and that is that a couple of weeks ago I joined a class that Sarah Brown is teaching at Space on Tolkien's letters, and she wanted to talk about the famous plots declension, the letter that Tolkien wrote to Dick Plotz, where he laid out a couple of declensions of Quenya nouns, and she wanted somebody to come in and talk about the linguistics of it. And so in doing some prep for that, I was looking back at Vinyar Tengwar 6, which was one of the early places that the declension was published. It was around 1989. It was published in a bunch of places, but including Vinyar Tengwar 6. And so I pulled up my collection of early Vinyar Tengwar issues, and it was just really fun. Right? Normally when I read Vinyar Tengwar, it's for the linguistic information. But I decided to go back and start reading the very first issue. And it actually took on a whole new interest to me in terms of the people and the events that get talked about. And I just want to share some of it because it's really fun. The very first article in the very first issue of Vinyar Tengwar, which is I just want to sort of show you. So this was done on an Apple II computer, which is also dear to my heart because I had an Apple II computer around the same time. And actually reading the Jorge's enthusiasm, the founder of Vinyar Tengwar, his youthful enthusiasm kind of actually reminds me of myself at that age. But he's talking about his visit to MythCon 19, and he talks about meeting Christopher Gilson in his house, and he got to see a new issue of Palmer Eldalambaran. I don't know whether that may have been 6 or 7. It would have been around that time. And then he said, before coming to MythCon, I discussed the idea of starting up the Mythopoeic Linguistic Fellowship again with Chris Gilson. He told me to pursue the idea. And then he continues on. Before the conference ended, all the people who were interested in forming a new linguistic fellowship met together in our unofficial and informal first meeting. And he mentions Paul Hyde. And he says some of the highlights of our meeting. Paul stated that he now has about 18,000 morphological entries on his computer. Chris said if Paul was going to work on a dictionary, he would like to do an Elvish thesaurus. Paul showed everyone his dissertation, the length of which was equal to several telephone books. He also showed us his linguistic cross-index of etymologies, which numbered over 500 pages. Thus, Paul, Nolan, Hyde, Chris Gilson, Bill Weldon, Patrick Wynne, Arden Smith, and myself attended the first elf meeting. Additionally, we discussed plans to revise Jim Allen's Introduction to Elvish by the centennial of J.R.R. Tolkien in 1992. That was very, very wishful thinking. I'll also just quickly point out, I'll say more about Paul Hyde in a moment, but I also want to mention another fun little thing, which is over in Vinyar Tengwar 4. There's a note here. Carl F. Hofstadter wishes to get in touch with other elf members who wish to participate in a project to develop a Tengwar and Kurth font for the Apple Mac computers. I think that's the first mention of Carl. Obviously, Carl went on to become the editor of this, take over Vinyar Tengwar. But it's fun seeing all these people, some of whom I've become friends with since. Chris Gilson. One person I unfortunately did not have the opportunity to ever meet was Paul Nolan Hyde, who Jorge discusses. But I was able to acquire this a couple of months ago. This is not the 500-page multiple telephone directory, but it's sort of similar. This is a working concordance, being a compilation of names, places, things, and language elements, together with volume and page number of every occurrence in the following works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and it includes all of the history of Middle-earth up until that point as well. This is from January 1988. It's the second printing of it, and I'll just sort of hold up as an example of what sort of thing this looks like, produced on a dot matrix computer. But this is very dear to me because the late Paul Nolan Hyde was, in many ways, the work that he did was a precursor to a lot of what the Digital Tolkien Project is doing. And I'm particularly interested in researching more of those sorts of early efforts, people like Bob Foster, Paul Nolan Hyde, and others, particularly for this book chapter that I'm writing, because I do want to talk in that book chapter about sort of the whole history of the use of computers in the study of Tolkien. Anyway, okay. In terms of how big my Tolkien collection is, Sarah, smaller than some people in this chat right now. I would estimate it's probably 300 books, maybe. I need to catalog them better. I have on the order of 72 copies of the Silmarillion and between 5 and 10 copies of each volume of the History of Middle-earth. They're the ones that are... I mean, I've got probably more than 10 Lords of the Ring. Lord of the Rings. I don't know. How do you plural? Anyway, we had this discussion before about how you pluralize Silmarillion. But anyway, I need to catalog them at some stage. But as I said, there are people even in this chat right now that have considerably more books than me, I'm sure. Although Trotter can't join us tonight. Trotter would normally be here. He certainly has more than me. The only thing about dot matrix printers, though, was how difficult they were to initially configure. Remember, you had the dip switches. You had to, for every different computer, you had to work out exactly how to configure the printer by tweaking these little tiny switches at the back of the printer. That was always fun. But anyway, yes, I had a dot matrix printer with my Apple II, and the first few issues of Vinyar Tengwar are published like that. But later on, they become a little better looking. I think they were done on a Mac then. Obviously, I presume Carl did it on a Mac when he took over. But I even think Jorge may have gotten a Mac at some point. Anyway, it's a really fun read. As I said, I'm so used to reading this for the linguistic information, but it's also really fun just to see the people that are talked about and the events and that kind of stuff. Okay, I don't think Carl's with us today, so he can't... I'm sure Carl has so much that he could say about that period of time. I would really, really love to see some maybe oral history or something about that sort of stuff, not just the stuff in the fanzines, but actually interviews with all the people that were involved in all of that. Okay. Let me talk about Rimbë. So for those of you who didn't see the last update, Rimbë is the tool that I built last April to help us crowdsource certain annotations about the text, particularly to do with characters and locations and things like that. Because one of the things that we want to do to address a lot of different research questions is where are events happening? When are they happening? So one of the goals is to, for example, be able to say for a given paragraph in the text, when and where is it taking place? What characters are present and so on. And that ties in with other stuff we've already done, like the speaker identification, where we've gone through and worked out who's speaking at every point. But there's all sorts of really interesting questions that can come out of that, but there's a lot of work to do to get that information in. Now, last time I showed Rimbë, there'd only been work done on 2 chapters. Now you can see there's a lot more work that's at least been, there's a lot more chapters in there. Work hasn't necessarily been completed. But I want to show a couple of things just to give a bit of update. One of the things that I've worked on since the last meeting is, since the last live stream, is many meetings in the Council of Elrond. It's really funny, when we started this, we went straight to the ring goes south to avoid the complexity of the Council of Elrond. It turns out the Council of Elrond, for the purposes of the kinds of annotations we were doing, is actually the easiest chapter in the world to do, because it's the same characters almost through. Once you get to the Council of Elrond, it's the same set of characters and they're in the same location. So it's actually really, really simple, not complicated. Where it's going to become complicated, I'll just point this out, is that at the moment we're just focused on the narrative mainline. We're just focused on annotating what's going on in the sort of top level of the narrative. So we're not covering things that are retold in speech. Once we do that, and the way that we will do that is basically treating each of those as if they were separate texts. So Gandalf's recollection of the things that happened that he tells at the Council of Elrond are effectively just a different story. They're different. They've got speakers and narrative and so on. It's conveyed entirely in direct speech at the Council of Elrond, but you can extract that, and Gandalf becomes the narrator, and there's direct speech within that and so on. So we will do that analysis, and then the Council of Elrond will become complicated. But for now, it's not really. But I just want to show you. So for the Council of Elrond, I have done both the characters and the locations. I haven't done anything to do with scene boundaries yet, although they'll be quite simple for the Council of Elrond. But what I found, and I don't know if this has been your experience, Sarah and Hannah and others that have worked on this, is that it's the easiest thing to do is just to establish locations and characters. Characters is probably the easiest thing. And so we can get this visualization already now of where the characters in a particular chapter appear and where they speak. So Council of Elrond is very straightforward, because all the up to this, once the council begins, everyone's there. But you get some interesting patterns even in this visualization of when different characters are taking their part. So you get this sort of, the initial Gloin bit, then an Elrond bit, then a Boromir bit. Then you sort of get the first bit of Gandalf where there's a lot of interruption and interaction. Then there's the Legolas bit about Gollum. And then you just get this sustained Gandalf. And then there's lots and lots of back and forth. Until, of course, Frodo says, "I will take the ring," which is happening here. So seeing the characters present and when they're speaking, that's been done for quite a few chapters. The location's quite boring for Council of Elrond. As I said, it's all on the East Porch. But if I go back to some of the other things, many meetings is almost done. So I've actually completed everything for many meetings. Including the scene boundaries and flagging the scenes for various properties, and Hannah has gone through and verified the majority of that. So we're almost done with that. But I'll just again quickly show you some views of this. You can get a view of the characters that were participate in many meetings and when they're talking and so on. Here I have done the scene boundaries, and one of the things I implemented recently, actually implemented this while I was traveling, is the ability to toggle on those scene boundaries. So you can toggle the scene boundaries there and see exactly where the scene is changing. All this sort of information is stuff that we can eventually make available. Rimbë at the moment is very restricted in terms of who can access it. But these kinds of visualizations and the underlying data we plan to make fully available to everyone. And this is actually going to lead to a whole bunch of new types of little delvings as well, because obviously each of these visualizations could be published. Every single chapter, all 61 chapters of Lord of the Rings, can get both a character and a location. The location stuff can sometimes be tricky, and like if I look at the Lorien chapter, I'm about 2/3 of the way through that. But trying to identify the locations and exactly what the relationship of the Nimrodel Falls is to where the Talon is and all sorts of stuff like that, it's actually been really, really interesting. But what's nice... Oh my goodness, I haven't been sharing my screen the whole... Oh no. My apologies for that. Oh, gosh. What a waste of the last 10 minutes. Let me very, very quickly show you the stuff that I've been talking about this whole time. Okay, as I mentioned, we have a lot more chapters now. The Council of Elrond. Very, very simple in terms of characters, because they're the same characters the whole time. You can see what characters are participating and when they're speaking. I need to get better at keeping track of what I'm showing. My apologies. Location, dead simple for Council of Elrond because it's all on the East Porch. Thank you very much for bringing that up, Sarah. And then many meetings, as I said. Many meetings, which you can see from all this green, is almost done. Hannah's been going through and checking on my work, which is excellent. Thank you very much, Hannah. And but you can see, like, again, the visualization of what characters are involved. And as I said, one of the things that I've implemented is showing where the scene boundaries are. One of the things I've also been doing as I did this is better refining what it means for characters to arrive and depart and what exactly are scene boundaries and so on. So all that kind of work is continuing to be refined as I do more and more of this. Anyway, what I wanted to say, so I'd just been explaining that I'd been working on the locations for Lothlorien. Even before I do that, I'll do the Khazad-dûm locations. I haven't done the characters yet, but these are the locations in the Bridge of Khazad-dûm chapter. And this was really, really interesting because there's motion and stuff. It's a little tricky in some parts, but this is what I've currently got. It's interesting. I'm pretty sure that the Atlas of Middle-earth has mistakes in its portrayal of the layout of Moria. Just reading the text and coming up with these locations, I can't consolidate this fully with those. So it's going to be interesting working with people like Fornat at Artecraft to see how these sorts of things fits in with what they're doing over at Artecraft as well. One thing I just want to quickly point out about these locations is I've just given them names based on the initial way they're described. So, for example, the Chamber of Marzabul is not called the Chamber of Marzabul here, just because that's not what it's called when it's first introduced. And there's a lot I could say about this idea of different names for the same place and how do you identify a place that's got multiple names and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just going to leave that seed of a thought with you because it's relevant to some later stuff in the coming months that we're going to be working on. But you can see this sort of, I've just come up with descriptions of the places that are talked about and had to kind of work out what the relationship between the places is based on the text. What's ultimately really nice about this, I think, and really exciting, at least to me about this, is that all of this stuff is tied closely with the text. So we know exactly what paragraph introduces a place, describes a place, describes the relationship between places, introduces a character, describes a character, all of that kind of stuff intimately tied to a paragraph level, which is really exciting and relevant to the last thing that I'm going to announce in a moment. But before I do that, there's one other aspect of Rimbë that I do want to briefly mention, which is that even though the annotations are focused and were focused initially on annotating the actual, occasionally happens with the hosting company. It's back. Even though the annotations have initially been primarily focused on the actual secondary world of Tolkien, the characters and the locations in Middle-earth and so on. Excuse me. Of course, it can be used for real-world annotations as well. So one of the things that I started, I think just after maybe the last update, was to annotate Skull and Hammond's chronology with the people and places and other things that get mentioned. And then On the Trail has joined me in working on this, because he's done a ton of work on the chronology before, and the relationship between the chronology and the letters and all sorts of things around where Tolkien was at places he visited and where he was at a particular point in time. So I just want to very, very briefly show you the sort of slightly different application of the Rimbë technology, which is not paragraphs of text in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, but rather entries in the Skull and Hammond chronology. So you get an entry like this that just talks about the birth of Tolkien's father, Arthur, but it mentions people and it mentions locations. And so all of that modelling that we've done, it's not characters, but it's people that are mentioned. And one of the exciting things about this is going to enable, I think, a sort of analysis and searchability and linkability and so on that's just not possible with a printed book. There's so much really interesting information in well, not just the chronology, but a lot of books that get produced by Hammond and Skull and others. But it's particularly true of the chronology that printed books are only one way of presenting the information, and it's quite difficult to answer certain questions from a printed book. Like if you wanted to work out, what happened on this day, what happened on June 28th in the chronology. In a printed book, you have to go through every single year one by one, whereas this kind of annotation is going to enable all sorts of really interesting questions, but also relationship between people and so on. So I just wanted to briefly point out there's so much more that we're doing, and still so much more to do. But don't worry, Phil. I haven't touched it myself for at least a month. This is going to take years to do this sort of stuff. But I wanted to just illustrate that this kind of annotation of texts applies not only to the secondary world texts, but also the primary world. And there's all sorts of interesting things that are going to come out of this as well. Okay. That's all I'm going to say about Rimbë. I want to move on to I have an announcement, as Bilbo said. And it's something that has been planned for envisaged for a long time. Turned out to be really easy to do. I actually just did it yesterday. So this thing that I'm about to announce, was completely done, soup to nuts in beginning to end, yesterday. And it has to do with the referencing system, the citation system. That was one of the very, very, very first things that the Digital Tolkien Project did. So many of you may be familiar with the citation system in the context of Search Tolkien. So when you search for a word in Search Tolkien, it gives you, counts and results. The primary, or at least the initial motivation for Search Tolkien was actually not this kind of summary counting of how often words appear in different texts and so on. It was very specifically when you're trying to get the citation for a particular passage, you start typing in the passage. That's actually, so, love, it's one thing. You can see it's interesting that, love is mentioned 94 times, which is a frequency of 1.8 per 10k tokens and stuff like that, right? You get sort of this information, you get a sense of, and it's helpful if you're interested in, what letters mention love and that kind of stuff. But if you're trying to find where's the passage where Sam says, is it, I love him, I'm trying to think of the next line in it. I mean, I know it's that, verse, verse. giving away the inspiration for the citation system. But you get the point I'm making is that one of the principal goals, the initial goal of Search Tolkien was to enable you to very quickly get to this kind of reference, this kind of citation, 4.04.024, which is the 24th paragraph in the 4th chapter in the 4th book of Lord of the Rings. And this idea of having a citation system, I started developing it independently and then found out that, Sparrow Alden had done some work for The Hobbit and Eric Muller-Harder had done it for the Lord of the Rings. And so the citation system that I use in the Digital Tolkien Project for Lord of the Rings is actually sort of compatible with Eric Muller-Harder's. I made sure that they lined up perfectly, at least for the main text in Lord of the Rings. So these citations work for Eric Muller-Harder's work as well. So Search Tolkien was intended as a way of going from passage to citation. And I've documented the different citation systems here and how it works in The Hobbit and the Silmarillion and so on. But what was always missing was, I guess, two things. One was I've got a citation and I want to find out where it is without having to open up a chapter and count paragraphs. And I sort of, and the second thing is, well, I'll talk more about the first thing. I tried to mitigate that a bit by publishing these text files like this Hobbit Citation System Index. This is just a text file that lists the first few words of every single paragraph with a citation. So if you're trying to find, like I'll go back to Lord of the Rings, do it for Lord of the Rings. So if I'm trying to find that 40424, I can scroll down here and find 404, and so on, and I can find, I can find the beginning and the sort of context, which makes it easier to sort of skim through a text to find. But I always knew there'd be a better way. That what I really want to do is have some really quick way of saying, I've got this, I want to find this. I want to find the first couple of words of the paragraph, and maybe the context as well, the first couple of words of the surrounding paragraphs, so I can more easily find the place in the book. But the second thing that I wanted to make sure we had was a link. If you have a reference like LR4.04.024, it would be nice if rather than just a string of characters, if it was actually a link you could click on. And so I would like to announce Cite Tolkien. You can see it's at cite.digitaltolkien.com. And the basic idea, and I'll show in a moment, is that it gives a link for every single citation, every single paragraph, every single citable chunk, as we call them, in the various works. I've only put The Hobbit here initially. I'll put the others in the next week or two. But just to demonstrate it, I've put in The Hobbit. The key thing is that now when you cite something like H04005, you can actually make it a link. And so if I click on this, just to demonstrate it, this is what you get. You get a page specifically for that reference. It gives you the first three words and the last word. Tells you in this case that it's a paragraph as opposed to a stanza of poetry or a letter or a heading or something like that. But it also gives you the context. So if you're skimming through the book, you can easily identify what the entry is. And so the idea is that anytime you use one of these references, and I use them all the time, and other people are starting to as well, you can actually make them links. And they're useful. You can click on the link and actually get a bunch of information. There's also all sorts of things that could eventually be attached to this sort of stuff, but that's another seed I'll plant to harvest later. For now, the key thing is that references now are links, and I just want to quickly show you sort of the higher level thing. So if you go to The Hobbit, you get a list of the chapters with the numbers. If I click on a particular chapter number, I get the full overview of that chapter. So I can cite entire works, I can cite chapters, I can cite individual paragraphs. I can just drop into this and get a link for paragraph 9, chapter 9 of The Hobbit, and so on. So this is really, really exciting. And and I'll add other texts over time very shortly. I want to finish up by showing one really like Hiarian at Tolkien Gateway. I told him last night that I was going to announce this today, and he immediately implemented it in the Tolkien Gateway. So there is now a template. Excuse me. A template in when you're editing an article in the Tolkien Gateway that you can just mention H09009 and it builds the link and links to this site. So I'll just quickly show you. He's only added it in a couple of places, but I just love that he did this. I'll get rid of me. So in the article on this is kind of the fantastic thing about this whole approach is that it's so simple. That's what I said. That I didn't want to say I have a big announcement in the sense of the thing itself is big. It's small in terms of its simplicity and everything, but I think it's very significant. So if we look at Bilbo Baggins, the article on Bilbo Baggins, there is a reference number 7 it is. So normally when the Tolkien Gateway references things, quotations and so on, they just cite the chapter. But now they can cite the individual paragraph. If we look at number 7, hopefully you can see this. Instead of just showing the paragraph like it normally does, okay, let me get the context. So the context is this quotation here. And actually you can see it here too. Rather than just saying the Hobbit a short rest, it now says H03.044. And you can click on that and it takes you to cite.digitaltolkien.com. So you have the ability to link to exact passages, and you can get the context and so on, so people can find it in their print book and so on. So that was my exciting announcement. That said, this is still just a small step in some really, really exciting stuff that's being worked on in collaboration with others like the Tolkien Gateway, a Tolkien Collector's Guide, and others. And there's going to be a lot of really exciting stuff, I think, coming out of this sort of thing and some other... sorry, I got distracted by the chat. I always struggle with, do I follow the chat? Do I talk? Anyway, lots of exciting stuff that's going to come out of this. This was a small step that's going to enable a lot of things. It is just the Hobbit right now, but only because that's what I did yesterday. I mean, literally, this was built yesterday. Obviously, building on years of work, but it only has the Hobbit at the moment. But I'll add Lord of the Rings. It'll pretty soon have everything that's covered by Search Tolkien. So the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, and Unfinished Tales. I have to work out what to do with the letters. I mean, what I'll probably do is just redirect to the Tolkien guide to the letters, the Tolkien Collector's Guide, guide to the letters, because that's the de facto link and identifier for letters in my mind, and certainly increasingly will be so in this universe of Digital Tolkien Project and other projects that are collaborating on this stuff. So that's it for what I wanted to talk about this month. In terms of, so I made the call. I'm actually showing less here than I was back on these pages. So on these pages, like on The Hobbit, I was showing the first 5 words. I've had discussions with various people about where to cut this off, like what is the right number to cut this to cut this off to be fair use. I decided 5 words was probably too much to include, so I'll probably get rid of this and just stick with the first 3 and last. I think there's a case to be made that this is fair use and is not sharing enough of the text to be problematic. I've certainly not heard anything, but obviously that's something that's important and matters. But I think we're fine with this. It's a trade-off. I mean, I would dearly love to be able to show the full text, I've talked before as well about the fact that, people quote, they'll do these nice images that they either do themselves or they get out of a Kindle or something, like a Tolkien quote that they extract. And it's kind of frustrating to me that there's nothing wrong with people doing that. But it would be infringing HarperCollins and the estate's copyright if I made a tool that helped people do that. So they can do it manually, but they can't have a tool to do it because that would involve... it'd be interesting if you sort of had a button here that generated a nice quote picture, quote image or whatever. But that's not going to happen because that's obviously would enable exposing the entire text, which I don't want to do. And so in everything we're doing here, I'm trying very hard not to expose the full text. And in this case, we just have the first three letters and the first three words, first three tokens, and the last token. Maybe it needs to be reduced to 2. I don't know. It's a very, very difficult question, but hopefully this won't cause problems. Anyway, that's all I've got. Unless people have other questions about this stuff. Thank you very much, as always. Those of you who join me live, and thank you also those who are watching the recorded version as well. Lots more coming. I'm really excited about things that I'm going to be able to announce over the coming months, including some, as I said, some really fun collaborations at the very end of the year. Lots of writing to do as well for articles and book chapters and stuff like that. But it is a really good time for the Digital Tolkien Project. A lot of things are finally coming together. We're really, this is a multi-year effort where sometimes it feels like, or sometimes it may seem like, we're working on all these disparate, unconnected things, but they're not at all. They're all part of a larger vision, and they're starting to come together really nicely now. And things like the citation system is key to that, and there's some other stuff to do with people and locations and stuff like that as well. That's gonna bear a lot of fruit, I hope, in the coming months. I will quickly mention, and this is a good point to leave on. Of course, it's the centenary of Christopher Tolkien's birth this year. November 21st this year will be the centenary of his birth, and I'm really excited that there'll be bigger stuff to announce as part of that, because in so many ways the Digital Tolkien Project is standing on lots of shoulders of giants, but Christopher Tolkien more than anyone else. He really started this whole thing in a way. So I'm excited to be this year for things to really be coming together for Digital Tolkien Project as it's Christopher's centenary. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, and I will see you in Discord, see you in the YouTube comments, wherever. Thanks very much.